There was another section from the book In Light of Our Differences by David Harmon that I wanted to share. For those who aren't aware, I read that book as part of my research for my video on diversity, and although it wasn't relevant to that particular video, I really enjoyed this section in the book on polythetic morality and its relation to the unity versus uniformity distinction that Harmon was making in chapter 5. Now, prior to making the argument in favor of polythetic morality, Harmon establishes a position that I also share, which is that you can value cultural diversity while still opposing certain cultural practices. He says, quote, "Now, most people could easily rattle off dozens, probably hundreds of specific cultural practices that they find reprehensible. My list," this being Harmon, who I'm quoting, "would range from the so-called honor killings in some parts of the Middle East, to the slaughter of endangered species to satisfy demands for traditional Asian medicinals, to the selfish propensity of Americans to drive absurdly oversized, wasteful cars, thereby depleting the world's fossil fuels and polluting the planet beyond all reasonable necessity. I can understand, if perhaps only at a basic level, the various reasons that are given to justify each of these cultural practices. Furthermore, I can appreciate that some of them are products of cultures other than my own, and that I therefore may never be able to fully understand why others value them. So I acknowledge the autonomy of other cultures and the beliefs contained in them. Yet despite my support for preserving cultural diversity, I still wish to see these particular cultural practices disappear. I take this stance unapologetically because it really is a fallacy to say that one cannot be an advocate for cultural diversity just because it encompasses snuff films as well as the Sistine Chapel. That's a position that I share. Some people treat it as an inconsistency, I just don't see it. I appreciate culinary diversity, but that doesn't mean I'm going to eat any and everything that's put in front of me. I can still have taste. I can still have standards. I can still have things that I like and things that I dislike. I can still make judgment calls, even if those judgment calls, I acknowledge, are coming from a subjective position. I can hold and stand by my opinions, just as you can, even to the contrary. There are a lot of abuses that parade under the banner of cultural practices. And this isn't specific to any culture. Like reactionaries do this thing where they call out these specific practices of a people group that they are bigoted against as a kind of post hoc justification for the bigotry. That is not the position that I hold. I value all people because they are people. And because they are people, there are going to be things that they do or say or believe that I agree with, and things they do and say and believe that I disagree with. And me disagreeing does not automatically mean that I am bigoted against them as people. But I do hold it within my rights to be quote-unquote bigoted against ideas and practices that I believe cause harm. I don't think the term bigoted even really applies, but if we want to go down that route, I'm a bigot against Zionists, I'm a bigot against Nazis, I'm a bigot against white supremacists, I'm bigoted against fascists. And it is not because of who they are as a person, it is not because they have a particular skin complexion, or a particular geographical origin, or in any way taken away from their humanity. I am just recognizing that their ideas and practices are harmful and I oppose them unequivocally. So now let's turn to what Harmon is talking about with this concept of polythetic morality. Because he's saying that advocating for cultural diversity is clearly not the same as advocating for a flaccid cultural relativism, a doctrine that is, quote, as indefensible at the level of logical consistency as it is at the level of content. The relativist inevitably ends up contradicting himself, since he presents his doctrine as absolute truth, and thus by his very gesture undermines what he is in the process of asserting. Furthermore, and more seriously, the consistent relativist writes off the unity of the human species. The absence of unity allows exclusion, which can lead to extermination. What is more, a relativist, even a moderate one, cannot denounce any injustice, any violence that may happen to be part of some tradition other than his own. Clitoridectomy would not warrant condemnation, nor would even human sacrifice. Yet it might be argued that the concentration camps themselves belonged, at a given moment of Russian or of German history, to the national tradition. What we must do, according to Todorov, is simply acknowledge that we humans all belong to the same species. That is not very much, but it is enough to serve as a basis for our judgments, allowing us to recognize that justice is nothing but another name for taking the entire human race into account. This founding principle of ethics is augmented by a political principle the French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu stated long ago, that the unity of the human race must be recognized, but also the heterogeneity of the social body. It then becomes possible to make value judgments that transcend the frontiers of the country where one is born. Tyranny and totalitarianism are bad in all circumstances, as is the enslavement of men or women. This does not mean that one culture is declared a priori superior to others, a unique incarnation of the universal, but it does mean that existing cultures can be compared, and that more may be found to praise in one place, more to criticize in another. And I've noticed that this position is taken in exceedingly bad faith, as though seeing the human in another place, but disagreeing with the way that they treat other humans, makes you the next Catholic Inquisition or white supremacist colonizer. While the rhetoric of cultural criticism has been used as a cover for colonial and imperialistic actions, that doesn't discount the merit of the criticism, and it does not automatically place you in the same box as somebody who is making similar criticisms or even the same criticism with a very different motivation and accompanying package of prescriptions. Like, I can criticize a particular cultural practice and advocate for dialogue and engage with the critical elements within that society, or I can criticize a culture and advocate for invasion and occupation and forcible assimilation practices. Those are clearly very distinct proposals, even if they may share a vague similarity in the sense that they are both criticizing a particular target. Let's continue what Harman is saying. To some extent, the whole history of Western moral philosophy has been a search for a universally applicable formula governing right values and the behaviors that ought to issue from them. And as we've seen, Western history attempted to impose its values through violence, or to use otherwise noble values as a cover for clearly ignoble aims, such as colonialism and imperialism. I'll continue. In other words, it has been a search for a monothetic consensus on core values. Anyone who has dared suggest that this might be a waste of time, a case of looking for the wrong thing, has been immediately cast out and branded an anarchist, a nihilist, or at best, a relativist. Well, Harman isn't an anarchist, as should be clear, but the value of his work remains. Yet the plain fact is that people do not agree on ethics, that the actual state of affairs is one of moral pluralism. People do use desert tortoises for target practice, and, much as I may despise them for it, they think there's nothing wrong about it. The only way an absolutist approach to ethics can deal with this is by stubbornly and repeatedly asserting that one's own code is right and everybody else's is wrong. So far, it has been a spectacularly ineffective approach, for it is evident that all the religious and ideological argumentation since the dawn of history has as yet done little to convince people to adopt a single code of conduct, to adopt Voltaire's solution, as we have called it. It may yet happen, not quite literally perhaps, but practically, because globalization is now creating, for the first time, the technological and social conditions necessary to achieve widespread homogeneity in ethics as well as other aspects of culture. Whether such homogenization actually comes about remains to be seen. In any case, I have tried to argue that the threat is real. To skip ahead slightly, what I wish to emphasize here is the special quality ethical assertions must take on when dealing with diversity as a condition to be valued. To say diversity is good and ought to be valued is radically unlike most traditional value statements, which propose that some specific characteristic or behavior, for example, truthfulness, charity, compassion, bravery, etc., ought to be valued. When I say diversity ought to be valued, what I'm really saying in terms of ethics is that we ought to embrace the fact that there are different, sometimes conflicting moral norms, that moral pluralism as such is a good thing, better than Voltaire's solution, even if it could be shown that attainment of universal ethical agreement would result in less strife among the world's people. The reason is because the distillation of sameness from diversity is essential to whatever it is that makes us human, no less in ethics than in any other sphere. A world where everybody held the same values might indeed be far more peaceful than the one we have now, but it would not be a human world in any recognizable sense. This stance in favor of moral pluralism does not commit one to relativism, as is so often charged. There is another, non-relativistic alternative to absolutist ethics, one that I shall call polythetic morality. A polythetic morality is based on a set of two linked assertions. First, that there is great value in the failure of all people to share all core values of morality absolutely. That is, it is good that a monothetic consensus of values does not exist. Second, that there is equally great disvalue in the failure of most people to share most core values pluralistically. That is, it is bad that a polythetic consensus on values does not exist. Unlike absolutist ethics, a polythetic morality is satisfied that not everyone agrees on every moral issue. Unlike relativist ethics, a polythetic morality does not disown assertions of right and wrong and other value judgments. It recognizes that competing moral assertions, including absolutist ones, are parts of a larger ethical landscape whose overall diversity is worth being preserved. Under a polythetic morality, people strive to convince others of their moral code, and it is this process of striving that is good. If, however, any one moral code should triumph absolutely, it would be bad. The reason is that people are often simply mistaken about right and wrong, good and evil. No matter how rational, enlightened, and progressive a given ethical stance may appear to its proponents at a particular moment in history, any kind of moral certitude closes down self-criticism. At worst, it leaves society susceptible to demagoguery, to twisted dreams of apartheid, master races, and final solutions. At best, it stunts the capacity for ethical reflection and leaves people less able to adjust their behaviors to new social circumstances. So he's not saying here that everybody agreeing that killing is wrong would be a bad thing. More so that everybody agreeing killing is wrong might lead to a degradation of people's ability to reflect, to ethically reflect, to morally reason, to consider the specifics and nuances of the situations they encounter. And that practice of moral and ethical reasoning and striving toward a polythetic consensus has a worth in itself. How can human unity be achieved without uniformity? Long ago, Rousseau suggested an answer. According to him, the principal characteristic of human behavior is perfectibility. That is, something that has no positive contents, but that allows human beings to acquire all contents. Thus, universality gets an unexpected twist. What is common to human beings is not any particular trait, but rather their freedom, their capacity to transform themselves, potentially for the better. So if we define the achievement of unity among humankind as the best state of life, and if, with Rousseau, we accept freedom as our behavioral imperative, we see then that we cannot achieve unity through uniformity because uniformity throttles freedom. And deprived of freedom, we would be denied that which lies at the heart of our behavior, that which is truly common to us all. The paradox is that perfectibility, rather than perfection, is what must always lie ahead of us. The striving, not the getting. The freedom to improve ourselves can come only from a world of difference. And the wider the spectrum of genuine diversity, the more the scope of freedom expands. But if we allow ourselves to be lured by uniformity, by imagining we will be just as happy, happier even, in a world where everyone speaks the same language and sees the same weeds, then we will have lost both the hope and the means of perfectibility. The striving will be over. And on a final note, to achieve a polythetic consensus on core values would be to achieve unity in the truest sense, because such broad, but not absolute, agreement confirms the psychological mechanism upon which our common humanity is founded. Uniformity is often confused with unity, but the basic difference between them is this. To realize uniformity is to achieve an endpoint, whereas to realize unity is to engage in a continuous, never-to-be-completed endeavor. In line with Jamesian pluralism, there is always more to the realization of unity, always new and changing conditions to take account of. This is also in line with Beckner's proviso. One must have a wide knowledge of different cultural approaches, and a commensurately wide knowledge of how nature functions, before one can begin to define a meaningful set of core values on which to found a polythetic consensus. The corollary is that the realization of unity demands the continuation of the odyssey of evolution, and therefore requires an ongoing biocultural presence. Thus, in defining core values, one must give serious consideration to the ethical claims of other species, as well as to the need to preserve the diversity of our interactions with them. Nothing less is required for a full polythetic morality. The price one pays for adopting polythetic morality is that one must accept that no absolute ethic can ever preserve diversity, including one that says we must preserve diversity absolutely. The fact that extinction has happened since the beginning of life is important, though not because of the erroneous inference that extinction is inevitable and so we needn't be concerned with it. Rather, it shows that there is no precedent in evolutionary history from which to derive an ethic that says all extinctions should be prevented. So the quest is not to preserve every product of diversity, but to preserve the viability of the evolutionary processes that produce diversity. Note, however, that preserving the processes will necessitate preserving a large portion, in fact, a very large portion, of the products. So I think the language and idea of polythetic morality is very useful, and I just wanted to share with you all. I'm sure this can spark some excellent and fruitful conversation in the comments.